Welcome to Dor Lador, Jewish History and Culture. Dor Lador means from generation to generation, and that is precisely the journey we are on. Join us as we travel across centuries and continents to uncover the remarkable people, places, traditions, and ideas that built Jewish civilization. From ancient roots to modern realities, this is where the Jewish story comes alive.
I want you to picture a scene, right? We are in the 1970s, deep in the Soviet Union. Specifically, we are in the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic in this heavily industrialized, concrete-laden town called Rivne.
Oh, yeah, it's a bleak setting.
Exactly. And this is an era and a place where the state surveillance apparatus is, it's arguably the most sophisticated and ruthless in human history. The KGB has informants literally everywhere.
Yeah, in the factories, the apartment stairwell.
And the bread lines, right. And the state has officially criminalized any public religious expression. It's illegal.
Completely banned.
But operating entirely under the radar, right under the noses of these local KGB officers, there is this elderly man running an entirely illegal underground religious network.
It's honestly like something out of a spy novel.
It really is. He is traveling in the dead of night, using coded language, slipping into basements to perform these illicit religious ceremonies. He is completely outsmarting a global empire.
And the sheer mechanics of his survival. Because, he wasn't a trained spy.
Right.
He wasn't some political dissident with foreign backing or a radio transmitter. He was a deeply ascetic spiritual leader known as the Ribnitzer Rebbe.
A rabbi.
Exactly. And his ability to evade the Soviet state, to maintain this clandestine network for decades, it wasn't born out of modern espionage tactics at all.
No, his survival manual was, it was a philosophy forged in the dirt of the Carpathian Mountains nearly 2.5 centuries earlier.
Yeah, in the mud.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today, because if you follow Jewish history, or really any religious history, you know the accepted origin story of Hasidism.
Sure, the standard narrative.
Right. The Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, he sparks this massive spiritual movement of the 18th century. And the history books have always pointed to a very specific region, Podolia, which is in modern-day Ukraine.
That's been the undisputed geographical anchor for, centuries?
And here's where it gets really interesting, that historical consensus is shifting.
It is. We are looking at some groundbreaking research today by Moshe Idol.
He's a prominent Romanian-Israeli historian, right?
He is. And he basically went back to the original texts, mapped out the constantly shifting borders of 18th century Eastern Europe, and realized that we've been looking at the wrong side of the border entirely.
Wow. The wrong country.
Yeah. Idol's research suggests that the Baal Shem Tov's true spiritual roots and his physical birthplace actually lie in the historical region of Moldavia.
Okay, so to give you a modern map, historical Moldavia covers the present-day Republic of Moldova, the northeastern chunk of Romania, and its southern Bukovina.
Exactly. And that shift, it completely reframes the narrative.
How so?
Well, we are moving the birthplace of this democratizing, nature-focused theology out of the relatively settled Polish territories, and we're dropping it right into one of the most volatile, culturally blended, and rugged frontiers in European history.
It changes the whole context. So our mission for this deep dive is to track this new geographical trail.
Right. Let's unpack this.
We are going to start in the 18th century Borderlands, and we're going to follow the Baal Shem Tov up into the freezing, isolated peaks of the Carpathian Mountains.
The deep wilderness.
Yep. Then we'll descend into a partially buried, secretive wooden synagogue in Romania. We'll track these massive demographic shifts in the Bessarabian agricultural colony.
The huge population boom.
And finally, we'll end up right back in that Soviet underground in the 20th century. We really want to figure out how this specific Moldavian landscape didn't just passively, host a religious movement, but actively forged it.
Yeah, and to trace that causality, we really have to establish the physical reality of his birthplace.
Right, town of Okopy.
Okopy, yes. So if you plug Okopy into a GPS today, it drops a pin in the Ternopil Oblast of modern-day Ukraine.
Yeah.
But the macro location is way less important than the microgeography here. Okopy was built as a fortress in the late 17th century by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
A military stronghold.
Exactly.
Right, so you're talking about a town that is literally mere steps away from the modern borders of Moldova and Romania.
Yes.
It's a total frontier outpost. You have Polish military forces stationed there specifically to block invasions from the Ottoman Empire and their vassal states to the south.
The environment was just incredibly tense. So by the time Israel ben Eliezer is born, which is around 1698 or 1700, Okopy is the absolute bleeding edge of the empire.
The edge of the world for them, basically.
Pretty much. And this brings us to Moshe Idol's linguistic argument, which is fascinating.
Yeah, let's get into the text.
So the primary historical source we have for the early life of the Baal Shem Tov is a hagiography, like a holy biography.
Right, a text focusing on his spiritual life and miracles.
Exactly. It was published much later, and it's called In Praise of the Baal Shem Tov. In that text, there is this very brief, really cryptic line about his parents. It just states that they lived at the edge of Wallachia.
Okay, wait, see, I hear the word Wallachia, and my mind immediately goes to southern Romania, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula territory.
Right.
It doesn't exactly sound like it belongs in the origin story of Eastern European Jewish mysticism.
I mean, in a strict modern geographical sense, you'd be right. Wallachia is south. But in the 18th century, Wallachia wasn't just a specific southern province on a map.
What was it, though?
The term was routinely used by surrounding nations as a linguistic catch-all phrase. It basically described the entire Romanian-speaking region.
So Idol is saying that whoever wrote down that early biography wasn't referencing the far southern province.
No, not at all.
They were just saying his parents lived on the Moldavian, Romanian-speaking side of the border rather than deep inside the Polish-controlled side of the fortress.
And that subtle shift, just moving across the river, it changes the entire cultural context of his upbringing.
But I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Is a geographical technicality really enough to completely rewrite the origins of a major world religion? I mean, moving a family a few miles south across a river, does that actually change the theology?
Oh, absolutely. It changes the theology because it fundamentally changes his exposure.
How so?
Well, consider the standard trajectory for a promising young Jewish scholar in the early 18th century. Upward mobility meant moving into these highly insulated, elite urban scholastic centers. You went to places like Vilna or Prague, you sat indoors in a yeshiva, a traditional religious academy, and you spent, 12 to 14 hours a day debating incredibly dense Talmudic legal texts.
You're studying nonstop.
In a very homogeneous, highly structured environment. The physical world outside the window was entirely secondary to the intellectual world of the text.
So it's a very rigid top-down hierarchy. You basically earn respect through elite literacy and scholastic endurance.
But the Baal Shem Tov didn't have access to that.
Right, he was born poor.
He was born into a poor family on a militarized borderland. I mean, think about the sensory input of that specific Moldavian frontier.
Yeah, paint that picture for me.
You have Polish soldiers marching through, you have Ottoman merchants crossing the river, you've got Romanian-speaking peasant farmers working the fields, shepherds coming down from the mountains.
Total melting pot.
Totally. Various dialects, different religious traditions, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, all just grinding against each other on a daily basis.
It's literally the opposite of a quiet, insulated study hall. It is chaotic, it's muddy, and it's dangerous.
And growing up on that cultural tectonic plate fundamentally shaped his worldview. He became deeply comfortable with the rural, working-class reality of the peasantry.
Because he was one of them.
He witnessed a kind of raw, unfiltered physical existence that the urban elites in the scholastic centers completely ignored. I mean, the elite academies viewed the uneducated rural masses with a level of disdain.
They looked down on them, which perfectly sets up his rejection of that traditional academic path. In the 1720s, he gets married, right?
He does.
But instead of settling in a town, trying to find a wealthy patron, or seeking entry into an academy, he retreats completely from society. He moves deep into the Carpathian Mountains.
Specifically, he relocates right along the border of Romania and western Ukraine, pressing down into northern Moldavia and the Bukovina region.
And I think we really need to strip away the romanticism of this retreat.
No, absolutely.
Because when we say he went into isolation in the mountains to meditate, it sounds like he's on a peaceful sabbatical, like a spiritual retreat.
Yeah, it sounds like a vacation.
Right. But the reality was backbreaking poverty. To support his family, he took on brutal physical labor. He was digging lime and clay out of the deep mountain valleys.
And the physical mechanics of his daily life there are absolutely crucial to understanding his later teachings. He's not sitting under a pristine tree contemplating the universe. He is standing in freezing cold mud. He is striking the earth with a pickaxe. He is covered in dust and sweat, extracting heavy, wet clay from the side of a mountain.
And then his wife has the equally brutal job of hauling that heavy clay down the steep mountain trails into the local towns just to sell it so they can buy basic food.
A miserable existence.
And he is living this way for over a decade.
Yeah.
A period from the 1720s to about 1734, which is historically referred to as his concealment.
Right, the years of concealment. And during those years, his primary social interactions weren't with religious scholars.
Who was he talking to?
He was interacting with Romanian-speaking peasants, local woodsmen, shepherds, and he was likely even crossing paths with the haiduks, the local bandits and outlaws who used those dense Carpathian forests as a sanctuary.
Wow, so the theology of Hasidism is literally being forged in the dirt of those mountains. And just the sheer physical effort of survival, he experiences a radical theological shift.
He really does.
He begins to formulate the idea that God is not confined to the holy books or the elite study halls. You can find the divine spark in the physical world.
Yes, he democratized holiness. His core message became that God is omnipresent.
In everything.
In everything. God is in the clay you are digging. God is in the trees. God is in the physical exhaustion of hauling that clay to town, provided you do it with joyful devotion.
That is a massive shift from the yeshiva mindset.
It's revolutionary. He taught that you don't need to master ancient legal commentaries to achieve spiritual elevation. A poor, illiterate shepherd whistling a tune with pure intent could reach a higher spiritual plane than a cynical scholar reading the Talmud.
So wait, while the Baal Shem Tov is developing this concept, this idea of deveket, which translates from Hebrew as clinging or cleaving to God in every physical moment, is he the only one in these mountains having this specific type of realization?
Well, that's where the regional history gets amazing, because if you pan out and look at the broader 18th century, the Principality of Moldavia was actually experiencing a massive, intense mystical revival within Eastern Orthodox Christianity at the exact same time.
You're talking about the Orthodox monks.
There was a sweeping revival of an ancient Eastern Orthodox practice called
Issihas.
The term comes from the Greek word for stillness, rest, or silence.
What does that actually look like in practice, though?
Intensely focused, silent, contemplative prayer. Monks would combine the repetition of the Jesus prayer with very specific, regulated breathing exercises.
Like meditation?
Very much so. The goal was to block out the external world, achieve complete internal stillness, and reach a direct, experiential vision of the divine light.
Wow.
And in the mid-18th century, this practice was being aggressively championed by Orthodox monks in the Moldavian monasteries, most famously by St. Paisius Velichkovsky.
This is a wild historical parallel. I mean, think about it. On one side of the mountain range, you have Orthodox monks focusing on breath, stillness, and a direct experiential connection to God rather than rigid institutional hierarchy. And on the other side of the mountain, you have the Baal Shem Tov developing Hasidism, relying on devekut, focusing on continuous internal devotion and the rejection of rigid institutional elitism.
The structural parallels are basically impossible to ignore. Both movements represented a democratic, popular spiritual revival.
They were for the common people.
Exactly. They both reacted against an entrenched, elite religious bureaucracy that had essentially locked the common peasant out of profound religious experience.
Because the peasant couldn't read the dense texts.
Right. And both movements elevated the natural world as a primary space for divine encounter. And crucially, both movements bypassed the traditional academic hierarchies by relying on charismatic, living spiritual masters.
Okay. So in the emerging Hasidic movement, the followers relied on the tzaddik, the righteous one, the Rebbe, who served as a spiritual conduit.
Yes, and in the Orthodox tradition, the monks and lay people sought guidance from the spiritual elder who possessed the wisdom of experience rather than just formal institutional authority.
Okay, I am looking at these parallels and the timeline and the shared geography. And I have to ask, are historians suggesting that these two groups were actively collaborating?
Like a joint venture.
Yeah. Were Jewish mystics and Orthodox monks having clandestine interfaith dialogues in the Carpathian caves? Because it sounds almost too perfectly aligned to be a coincidence, but far too radically different in core theology to be a direct partnership.
It's a great question, but historians like Moshe Idol are very careful to clarify that there is no evidence of a formal theological summit in the woods.
Okay, so no secret meetings.
No, the Baal Shem Tov and St. Paisius Velichkovsky were not trading manuscripts or actively debating theology over a campfire.
That would be a great movie, though.
It really would be. But the overlap represents something much more organic. It proves that the cultural, political, and spiritual groundwater of 18th century Moldavia was uniquely primed for this specific type of mysticism.
The environment basically demanded a new coping mechanism.
That's exactly it. The region was exhausted by constant border wars, political instability, and just crushing poverty.
The people were tired.
They were. The rigid religious institutions, whether they were Jewish or Christian, offered very little comfort to a peasant whose farm had just been raided or who was struggling to survive the winter.
They needed something immediate.
Right. And the geography itself, the awe-inspiring, isolating beauty of the Carpathians, it naturally pulled people away from the urban centers and toward an individualized, nature-based spirituality. It was a shared cultural yearning. And the Moldavian landscape incubated similar solutions across entirely different faiths.
It just shows that ideas, even profound theological ones, they don't just drop out of the sky. The soil matters.
Absolutely.
And the soil of the Moldavian Carpathians grew a theology of resilience. But, a theology developed in isolation eventually has to face the real world.
It has to scale.
Right. So how does this mountain philosophy actually transition into a physical, lasting movement?
Well, it moves from the deep forests down into the towns. And one of the most fascinating physical manifestations of this transition happened in
Piatra Neamț.
That's a major trade and craft town in the historic Principality of Moldavia.
Yes, it is.
And it becomes the setting for this incredible, really evocative legend about the early days of Hasidism.
Yeah, according to deep-rooted local Romanian Jewish folklore, the Baal Shem Tov used the rugged heights mountain range in what is now a Romanian national park as his personal sanctuary.
His hideout, essentially.
Basically. He would spend his week isolated in those peaks, meditating, praying, just surviving in the wild. But the legend states that every Friday afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains and the Sabbath approached, he would physically descend the mountain trails and walk into
Piatra Neamț.
to welcome the Sabbath with the local Jewish congregation.
Think about the visual contrast there. I mean, you have the local tradesmen, the craftsmen, probably exhausted from a grueling week of commerce, gathering in their synagogue.
Dressed in their town clothes.
And walking through the doors is this mystic, fresh from the wilderness, bringing the intense, unfiltered spiritual energy of the mountains right into their sanctuary.
It's powerful, and that legendary connection eventually solidified into a physical monument.
How so?
Well, by 1760, the Baal Shem Tov had passed away in Medzhybizh, Ukraine, but his influence in the Moldavian region remained so potent that just 6 years after his death in 1766, the local ruler of Moldavia, Prince Grigor III Ghica, issued an official charter to the Jewish community.
And the charter granted them permission to rebuild their historic synagogue, right?
Yes.
Which had fallen into severe decay, and they were allowed to build it right on top of its original 15th century stone foundation.
Exactly. And the building they constructed, which, by the way, is still standing today as the oldest surviving wooden synagogue in southeastern Europe, is an absolute architectural marvel.
It's gorgeous.
It is. But its unique design wasn't born out of purely aesthetic choices. It was dictated by intense civic restriction.
Right. Because the historic Ottoman and Moldavian laws were incredibly strict when it came to the architecture of minority religions. The overarching, non-negotiable rule was that no non-Christian temple could be built taller than the local Christian churches.
And the intent of that law was visual dominance. The state wanted to ensure that the skyline always reflected the hierarchy of power. A towering synagogue would be seen as an affront to the dominant religious authority.
So if you are the Jewish community, you face a massive engineering and theological problem.
You do.
You want to build a grand, soaring sanctuary. You want a space that reflects the expansive, joyous theology the Baal Shem Tov taught.
Mm-hmm.
But the law says you cannot build up. The skyline is completely off limits.
So what do?
They make a radical architectural decision. They built down.
Right. To maximize their interior ceiling height without violating the external height restrictions, the builders excavated the site and dug the foundation 1.5 meters, about 5 feet straight down into the earth.
And walking into this building today is just a disorienting, beautiful experience.
Have you seen pictures of it?
Yes. And from the street, the synagogue looks incredibly modest. It is this low, unassuming structure. But the moment you open the front doors, the floor drops away. You have to physically step down a flight of stairs, descending below the frost line.
And the interior is split into 2 distinct, highly functional spaces. First, you enter the western vestibule.
Right.
And this section is constructed entirely of thick, white-painted stone masonry.
And the stone wasn't just for structural support, was it?
No, not at all.
Because Moldavian winters in the foothills of the Carpathians are brutally cold. A massive wooden hall is almost impossible to heat efficiently. So during the freezing winter months, the congregation would huddle in this smaller, insulated stone vestibule just for warmth.
Exactly. It was a survival mechanism. But when you step out of that stone vestibule and descend further into the Eastern Prayer Hall, you are suddenly enveloped in a massive, soaring hall built entirely of red-painted pine wood.
It is an incredible sensory shift.
Yeah.
You are standing 5 feet underground, but when you look straight up, you see the defining feature of these historic wooden synagogues, a massive, ribbed, octagonal wooden dome that towers over the center of the room.
The architectural intent was clearly to symbolize the vault of the heavens. They couldn't build a tower on the outside, so they built the sky on the inside.
That's beautiful, and the craftsmanship inside is just breathtaking. In 1835, so several decades after the initial rebuild, the congregation brought in a master woodcarver, and what he did to the interior elevated it to a masterpiece of Jewish folk art.
The Torah Ark, which sits on the eastern wall and houses the sacred scrolls.
And it's huge, right?
Oh, it is a massive 3-tiered wooden structure, intricately gilded and painted. He covered it in high-relief carvings of lions, griffins, twisting grapevines, and hands spread open in the traditional priestly blessing.
He also built the central bima, the raised octagonal platform where the Torah is publicly read, and he positioned it directly beneath the center of that towering wooden dome. So the physical act of reading the text becomes the focal point, linking the sunken earthly floor directly to the symbolic wooden heavens above.
And the artistic choices constantly bridge the local reality with the ancient heritage. On the western wall, for example, a sweeping panoramic view of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount dominated by the Dome of the Rock.
Wow.
But the perspective makes it look as though you are peering through a canopy of local Moldavian trees, gazing all the way to the ancient Middle East.
And there is also a layer of political history embedded in the site itself, tied to a 16th century royal legend.
Yes. Long before the Baal Shem Tov, the original stone synagogue on that exact spot was the site of a famous rescue.
The prince, right?
Yeah, according to Moldavian folklore, Prince
Petru Rareș
was fleeing from a Turkish assassination squad. Desperate for sanctuary, he begged the local Jewish community for help, and they successfully hid him inside the synagogue until his pursuers left.
That is incredibly risky for the community.
Highly risky. But it paid off because when the prince eventually regained power, he issued edicts protecting the Jewish community, granting them commercial privileges and royal favor.
It is just incredibly poetic when you take a step back and look at the Baal Shem Tov synagogue. The Ottoman and Moldavian imp told this community they couldn't reach for the sky. They forced them into the dirt. But by digging down into the cold, rocky Moldavian earth, they ended up building the exact theological concept the Baal Shem Tov had been preaching in the mountains.
Finding the divine spark in the earth.
Right. They proved that holiness isn't dependent on towering monuments or state approval. True elevation happens internally. They dug into the mud and they found the heavens.
The synagogue really proved that the movement could take root in the soil of Moldavia. But you know, a beautiful building doesn't change the course of history without a massive population to fill it.
Right. You need people.
Exactly. So how did this localized, nature-based theology scale up to become a dominant demographic force across Eastern Europe?
Well, that transition from a local mountain philosophy to a mass movement required a massive geopolitical earthquake. And that earthquake arrived in 1812.
Right. In 1812, following another brutal war with the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire formally annexed Bessarabia.
Bessarabia.
Yes, Bessarabia was the eastern half of the historical Principality of Moldavia. To map it to today, the territory they annexed constitutes the modern Republic of Moldova.
And when the Russian Tsars took control of Bessarabia, they integrated it into a massive legal and geographic zone known as the Pale of Settlement.
The Pale of Settlement. That was the designated western frontier of Imperial Russia. It was the only region where Jewish populations were legally permitted to live and travel.
And the Tsarist authorities looked at this newly acquired Bessarabian territory and realized they had a vast, relatively unpopulated agricultural frontier.
They needed people to work the land.
They needed farmers.
Yeah.
So they made a highly calculated economic move. They actively incentivized Jewish immigration into Bessarabia, offering free land, temporary tax exemptions, and relief from military conscription for any family willing to relocate and work the soil.
And that policy triggered a massive demographic explosion. The Tsarist government facilitated the creation of 19 distinct Jewish agricultural colonies across Bessarabia.
19 whole colonies.
Yeah, tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants poured across the borders from Poland, from Galicia, and from Ukraine. They packed up their lives, moved to these rural Moldovan farming colonies, and completely transformed the demographics of the region.
So you have this massive influx of new farmers trying to tame the Bessarabian soil. But they weren't just stepping into empty fields. They were stepping into the middle of a vicious 19th century ideological war zone.
They really were. On one side, you had the traditional established rabbinic elites who still viewed intense, isolated Talmudic study as the only valid path to spiritual worth.
The old guard.
Right. They looked down on these new, exhausted agricultural workers as uneducated peasants. But an even more aggressive challenge was moving in from the cities.
The Haskalah.
Yes, the Haskalah was the Jewish Enlightenment. Starting around the 1830s, this intellectual movement began radiating out of highly cosmopolitan cities like Odessa.
The progressives.
Exactly. The followers of the Haskalah, known as the Maskilim, viewed traditional, isolated religious life as backward and superstitious.
So the Haskalah pushed for aggressive modernization. They wanted secularized schooling, the adoption of the Russian language instead of Yiddish, modern European dress, and widespread cultural assimilation.
They wanted to pull the community into the modern world.
They believed the only way to survive the modern era was to integrate into it fully.
And let's look at the friction this caused. If you are a progressive Haskalah writer in a comfortable Odessa cafe, you are publishing essays mocking the Hasidic farmers.
Writing them off completely.
You view their ecstatic dancing and their reliance on a local rebbe as an embarrassing relic of the Dark Ages. But now, put yourself in the shoes of that Bessarabian farmer.
Right. Think about the physical reality of that farmer. You are waking up before dawn. You are breaking the dense Bessarabian soil to grow wheat and tobacco.
It's backbreaking work.
You are fighting drought, fighting taxes, and dealing with corrupt local officials. Your hands are calloused. You are physically exhausted by the time the sun goes down.
You don't have the energy or the literacy to spend 6 hours a day debating Talmudic law to please the traditional elites in the yeshivas.
Definitely not.
And you certainly don't have any interest in the Haskalah raiders from the city who are calling you a superstitious peasant and telling you to abandon your ancestral traditions.
So where do you turn?
You turn to the theology that meets you exactly where you are. Hasidism offered a profoundly egalitarian framework. The Hasidic Rebs traveling through these agricultural colonies didn't demand scholastic perfection.
What did they demand?
They demanded a pure heart.
They offered a religion built on joy, which is exactly what a deeply exhausted agricultural worker needs. Hasidism utilized powerful, wordless melodies.
I love that concept, wordless melodies.
You don't need to know the complex Hebrew translations. The melody itself is the vehicle for spiritual elevation.
The movement incorporated ecstatic dance, communal meals, and emotionally explosive prayer. The message was incredibly clear. Your sweat in the wheat field is just as holy, just as vital to God as the scholar's study, provided you act with joyful devotion.
Hasidism didn't just win the theological debate, it built a fortress around these farmers. The Hasidic leaders unified these disparate rural communities around shared rituals, shared songs, and a fierce collective identity.
They gave them something to hold on to.
They created a cultural bulwark that was entirely resistant to the secularization of the Enlightenment.
And because of this massive population base, Moldavia stopped being a mere outpost that hosted traveling rabbis. It became a powerhouse. It started producing its own homegrown spiritual dynasties. Soon, the major transnational dynasties recognized the vitality of the region and began establishing deep roots there. Throughout the 19th century, Moldavia transformed into a sprawling network of deeply entrenched spiritual courts.
But, the joyful music, the agricultural prosperity, and the thriving communities of the 19th century, they were essentially just a training ground.
The calm before the storm.
Because the resilience they were building in those farming colonies was about to face the ultimate test. As we cross into the 20th century, the landscape of Eastern Europe descends into unprecedented darkness.
The 20th century brought the absolute horrors of World War II. the systematic annihilation of the Holocaust under the fascist Romanian government allied with Nazi Germany, and ultimately the iron grip of the Soviet communist regime.
Under these totalitarian systems, the role of the Hasidic Rebbe underwent a radical, extremely dangerous transformation.
They could no longer operate as public spiritual guides or community unifiers. To survive, they had to become underground resistance leaders.
The stakes weren't just theological anymore.
No, they were literal life and death.
The Skillen dynasty provides a profound example of this transformation. In 1915, Rabbi Eliezer of Portugal took over the leadership from his father in Skilleni. And in a peaceful era, he would have spent his life teaching and counseling. But history dictated otherwise.
During the Holocaust, the fascist regimes absolutely decimated the local Jewish populations. Thousands of children were left completely orphaned, wandering the war-torn landscape.
And the Skillner Rebbe didn't just offer prayers for them. He took direct, highly illegal action. He turned his own home into a clandestine orphanage.
He personally adopted hundreds of these children. He wasn't just raising funds for them, he was physically housing them, feeding them, and sheltering them from the authorities.
Putting his own life on the line.
Every single day. And when the war ended, the danger didn't pass. The region fell under the control of the Soviet Union, which immediately instituted a massive anti-religious campaign, outlawing religious education and strictly monitoring communal life.
Because the Soviet state viewed any organized religion as a direct threat to communist ideology.
They couldn't tolerate competing loyalties.
He established an international network for underground education, ensuring these orphans were taught their heritage.
And he went further. Realizing that there was no future for these children under the oppressive Soviet system, he established highly dangerous anti-communist escape corridors.
Which is wild. How does a rabbi run a smuggling ring?
By utilizing every clandestine tactic available, he organized forged transit papers. He coordinated with underground networks to bribe border guards. He orchestrated midnight crossings, physically smuggling his adopted orphans and his followers out of Soviet-controlled territory, often routing them through Romania and eventually to the west.
But the KGB eventually caught on, didn't they?
They did. He was arrested multiple times. He was thrown into Soviet and Romanian prisons, subjected to intense interrogation and torture.
That's horrific.
But the moment he was released, often due to international pressure, he immediately went back to smuggling children. He turned the Baal Shem Tov's concept of finding the divine spark into a literal rescue operation.
While the Skillner Rebbe was smuggling people out, another figure made the incredible decision to stay behind and fight the regime from the inside. We have to look at the Ribnitzer Rebbe.
The story of the Ribnitzer Rebbe, it sounds like a spy thriller mixed with ancient mysticism.
It really does.
He operated out of Ribnia in modern Transnistria, Moldova from the 1940s all the way through the 1970s. During World War II, he survived the horrific conditions of the local labor ghetto.
And after the war?
After the war, when the Iron Curtain fell, he chose to remain in Soviet territory to serve the traumatized remnants of the Jewish community.
He lived as an extreme ascetic. He practiced severe self-denial, fasting constantly, wearing tattered clothes, and engaging in hours of weeping prayer.
But his physical frailty masked an absolute unyielding defiance of the KGB.
If you were caught participating in a religious ceremony, you could lose your job, your apartment, or be sent to the gulag.
The punishments were severe.
But the Ribnitzer Rebbe looked at those laws and completely ignored them.
He became the central node of a massive underground network. One of the most strictly prohibited practices was the Brit Milah, the ritual circumcision, which is the foundational covenant of Jewish identity.
And the KGB monitored hospitals and clinics specifically to ensure this wasn't happening.
They were constantly watching. So the Ribnitzer Rebbe took it underground, and I mean that literally. He would travel across the Soviet republics in the dead of night.
Just sneaking around.
Yeah, he used complex networks of informants to track KGB patrols. He would slip into the basements of apartment buildings, operating without anesthetics, performing circumcisions on infants and sometimes grown men.
Knowing that if a neighbor heard a cry and called the police, he would be arrested on the spot.
Right, but he performed thousands of these illegal surgeries over decades.
He also functioned as a secret shivchei, a ritual slaughterer. Soviet law dictated all food production, and kosher slaughter was banned. The Ribnitzer Rebbe would travel to rural farms at night to slaughter chickens and cattle according to religious law, ensuring the underground community could eat without violating their faith.
He also maintained illegal mikvahs.
What's a mikvah?
The mikveh is a ritual bath essential for Jewish family purity laws. Because the state had bulldozed the public bathhouses, the Ribnitzer Rebbe would lead his followers out to the frozen Dniester River in the middle of the Moldovan winter.
Into the river.
We started this deep dive with a young man, the Baal Shem Tov, digging clay in the mountains just to survive, seeking a way to feel closer to God outside the rigid rules of the city.
A man looking for the divine spark in the dirt and the mud.
Right. And 2 centuries later, leaders are using those exact same mystical traditions. The deep internal devotion, the resilience to orchestrate escape routes, save orphans from the Holocaust, and openly defy the KGB. The joy in the singing didn't just make them feel good.
No.
The joy became the mechanism of their survival.
Hasidism began as a theology of spiritual survival for marginalized laborers, and it evolved directly into a highly effective mechanism of physical and cultural survival against totalitarianism.
It's an incredible journey. We started on the volatile, multi-faith frontier of Okopy, where empires ground against each other. We followed the movement into the Carpathian Mountains, finding God in the silence and the labor.
We walked down into the buried architectural marvel of the Baal Shem Tov synagogue.
We saw the massive demographic boom in the agricultural colonies of the Pale of Settlement, where wordless melodies and ecstatic dancing won the hearts of exhausted farmers. And finally, we witnessed the ultimate spiritual resistance by the Rebbes of Skulin and Ribnitz, who weaponized their devotion against the 20th century's darkest regimes.
This history proves that a movement is intrinsically tied to the landscape that forms it. The mud, the mountains, the borders, and the friction of Moldavia are baked directly into the DNA of Hasidism.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Moldavian roots of Hasidism. Keep digging, and we'll see you next time.